So welcome everyone, it's a pleasure to see so many of you this evening for this program. My name is Edouard Kopp, I'm Chief Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute, and along with my colleagues, we're very happy to welcome you for this conversation with Pete Gershon from the Orange Show, and it's going to focus on the visionary arts of artists Joseph Yoakum and Jeffrey McKissack. And I just want to say that this is the last program in connection with the Joseph Yoakum exhibition this evening. And I invite you, in case you were not able to attend our previous events in connection with that exhibition, to watch them online on the Menil YouTube channel. So we had an excellent talk by Leslie Amberger, who's Curator of Folk Art at the Smithsonian Museum. And she gave a really enlightening lecture titled Game Changers, where she really placed Yoakum in the context, in a wider context of non-mainstream or self-taught artists in America. We also had a very interesting conversation between my co-curator Esther Adler from MoMA with Professor Anthony Pinn from Rice University, and it was about the spirituality in Yoakum's work. Another talk really worth looking at. And so our program this evening is organized, again, in conjunction with that exhibition, which opened on April 22nd and which will run through August 7th. It is the first major museum exhibitions focusing on Yoakum in more than 25 years. And as many of you will know, he was a self-taught visionary American artist whose life and work we will consider here tonight. Alongside that of Jeff McKissack, and we will hope to find some parallels between Yoakum on the one hand and the creator of the Orange Show on Houston's East End. So it's really a pleasure to have Pete Gershon with us this evening, and it's great for us to collaborate, to be able to collaborate with the Orange Show and to really celebrate for the duration of an evening, the rich offerings of visionary arts here in Houston. And we look forward to that conversation, and we hope to find some parallels between the endeavors and the context that are tied to McKissack and Yoakum. And before we get started, I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones, in case you haven't done already that. Also, this talk will be made available on the Menil YouTube channel in the upcoming weeks. So the way we're going to do things, I'll start by presenting some thoughts on Yoakum, then Pete in turn will talk about McKissack, we'll have a brief conversation, and then we will open for a short Q&A with you. And now I'd like to say a few words about Pete. And who probably for many of you does not need an introduction, but again, it's my duty, I have to do it. Pete is a writer, researcher, art historian, and curator of programs at the Orange Show Center for Visionary Art. He's the author of Painting the Town Orange, the stories behind Houston's visionary art environments, which he published in 2014. And it's really well documented and very readable and entertaining and stimulating. So I really recommend you this book. Pete has also published a book titled Collision, the Contemporary Art Scene in Houston from 1972 to 1985, which was published by Texas A&M University Press in 2018. And which got a prize. It was the Texas State Historical Association Ron Tyler Award for Best Illustrated Book on Texas History and Culture. And then Pete's latest book is titled Impractical Spaces, Houston. And that's a book coming out this year. And it's a collection of archival photography and first-hand accounts from founders documenting the histories of artist-run spaces in the city. So let's start with some thoughts on Yoakum. And what I'd like to do is to very briefly give you some background about him, try to give you a sense of what constitutes the hallmarks of his vision, but also touch upon what one could call the mechanism of his discovery and then more wider recognition. And then again, Pete will talk about McKissack. So the exhibition, Joseph Yoakum, when I saw, focuses on the dreamlike landscapes of Joseph Elmer Yoakum, a visionary artist largely associated with Chicago. And as many of you will know, historically Chicago has been a fertile ground for untrained, non-mainstream practitioners intent on creating art that was not following any conventions, but that was really made and imagined, very much on their own terms. And one thinks, for example, of artists like Henry Darger or H.E. Westerman. And the show illuminates Yoakum's vivid creativity, his very deep spirituality, and his imaginative vision of the land. And his landscape reveals a world that no one has seen before or since. It is dense with swelling landforms, serpentines, empty roads, and evergreen foliage, and almost always empty of people, and if they are not absent, they are very peripheral in their presence. And then finally, the show explores also Yoakum's rich and complex biography and identity. So much of what we know of Gershon Yoakum's extraordinary life comes from the artist himself. He was born in Ash Grove, Missouri in 1891, so about 25 years after the end of the Civil War. He had a dual background. He was African American, but also had Native American blood. On his father's side, the family had long claimed to have Cherokee heritage. As for his mother, she was born into slavery. Yoakum came from a modest background. His father was a farmer, and his mother a housekeeper. He had very little schooling, as far as we know, just a few months. And by the age of 9, he ran away from home to join circuses. So he joined his first circus in 1900, then joined the second one, which is no less than Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, and that's for a few years. And then from 1903 to 1908, he works for the Ringling Brothers, and in different capacities as a bill poster, a handyman, a horse trainer, and even a personal valet to John Ringling. In 1918, he's a conscript in the US Army and joins a non-combating segregated regiment in World War I in France, and that leads him to travel even more. And then by the early 1940s, Yoakum settles in Chicago, where he would live the rest of his life. He was married twice, but by the time he started making drawings, which was late in life, he appears to have been largely estranged from his family and to have lived a lonely existence. So an awareness of his biography is critical to a contemporary examination of Yoakum's body of work, which is, as you can see, marked by a distinctive linear style of draftsmanship with these very strong contours and his very beautiful colors that he adds. But so too, we have to recognize the agency of Yoakum's creativity in transforming his visual memories into remarkable works of art. And his drawings may be idiosyncratic, and one of the interesting practical aspects about their making is that he often used ballpoint pen, but also colored pencil, pastel, and watercolor, all this to convey his poetic vision of nature. And as is quite frequent with untrained artists, he worked with the simple materials he had access to. For example, he started by using manila paper, also ballpoint paints, and then really upped his game as he learned more about materials by himself, but also through the advice of other artists he met. So by any account, Yoakum was extremely well-traveled, and certainly for someone of his background, this would have been very, very rare. He had rich life experiences and demonstrated a great curiosity about the world. And these things certainly appear to have been a source of great personal pride. He insisted that every one of his landscapes was based on a first-hand experience of these locales. And as he put it, I quote, "I had it in my mind that I wanted to go to different places at different times. Wherever my mind led me, I would go. I've been all over this world 4 times." And I like the way he uses this term, this world, because often his drawing are otherworldly. And I come back to that, the idea of the physical world and the spiritual world. So most of Yoakum's landscapes represent North American locations, but he also claimed to have visited all the continents except Antarctica, which he nonetheless represented. And in traveling through America and abroad, you have been exposed to some of the most dramatic landscapes on Earth. And while his drawings may echo the external world, they provide little evidence of being grounded in observed topographical realities. And so it seems that his memories and his visions or his imagination of places all seem to have merged. So through drawing, Yoakum takes us on an epic journey amounting to a kind of graphic, personal, and often colorful travelogue around America and around the world. Again, based on foundational memories he would return to and filter through his deep religious faith. So the title of the exhibition, Joseph E. Yoakum, What I Saw, comes from an inscription we found, my co-curators and I, in a drawing, and you can see that, what I saw in Alberta. And it evokes 2 kinds of sight, the physical light of looking out into the world, and crucially for Yoakum, the spiritual act of looking inwardly, another kind of vision. And bringing his prolific imagination to paper, he opened up a whole new world, one that fuses inner and outer landscapes and blends imagined and real topographies. Here is one of my favorite drawings, and I'm very pleased to say it recently entered the Menil collection. When we started the project, we had 2 works in the show, one of which had been given by the Smither family, Stephanie Smither. And as part of this exhibition, we've received a gift of 9 drawings, including this one, from the lenders to the exhibition. So we're very pleased about that. And it's good for Houston, isn't it? So instead of trying to render the actual peculiarities of sites, Yoakum really stresses the unity and cohesiveness of the earth as a living organism, where mankind is largely absent and certainly not central. His resulting graphic landscapes offer a version of the world that is reconfigured, intensified, and also defamiliarized. His is a world where different rules apply, where the sun sheds neither light nor creates shade. And from the moment he started to draw in 1962, Yoakum felt a daily compulsion to depict landscapes painstakingly, creating hundreds of them, and mostly expansive views in a horizontal format. And all this over the course of a short career, which was only 10 years long, because he started late in life and then, unfortunately, passed away as a result of illness. So because Yoakum was active outside of the artistic mainstream and not subjected to the expectations of others, his landscapes do not show any obvious ties to earlier visual traditions, except possibly the kind of imagery he might have encountered as part of his involvement with circuses. And if you think of circus imagery, you think of fairly graphic imagery, high on colors, and relatively pared down in structure. But otherwise, it's very hard to tie Yoakum's and use that as a way to explain his approach to art. But they are actually illuminating aspects of his biography that are really illuminating his itinerant life, his propensity for storytelling, his deep spirituality. In addition to adhering to Christian Science, he had animist beliefs, which might have partly come from his Native American background. Also, he was fiercely independent in temperament. And so he had no formal art training and thus can be said to have not been restrained by the bounds of convention. And so he created deeply personal, idiosyncratic and poetic visions of the land. His line work is really a graphic language entirely his own. And what I'm showing you on the screen at left is a kind of little précis on a range of the mark making that he does, and it's called Yoakum's Basic Formal Devices. And this is actually the first art historical treatment of Yoakum, which was actually sitting in the archives of the Art Institute of Chicago, where so much of his work is kept. But I'm glad to say that this text is now finally published and then fully edited, and it's part of the big catalog. So it's a text by Whitney Halstead, a really important local figure who was also a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And you see the kind of range of his vocabulary. He's very interested in these emphatic contours, systems of double lines, systems of hatching, simple, like parallel hatching, or the kinds of hatching that are more like pyramid-shaped. And also at the bottom, you see these, the famous Yoakum trees, which are perfectly aligned. And if you go around the show, you'll see many examples. So he really created his own vocabulary and then exploited it ad infinitum, combining it and recombining it. And as you go around the exhibition, you'll recognize, and I urge you to use these little diagrams as sort of keys into his graphic intelligence. And I would say that his pictures often have color, but not always. But the structure, really the crux of them, is essentially about line. Yoakum's sense of space is really one of the hallmarks of his vision. It's complex, it's indeterminate, it's very ambiguous. He had a fascination with flatness, but also with movement. And he loved creating spaces where there's a kind of movement of push and pull. And depending on where you set your gaze in a composition like this one, if you look at the form next to it, or the form to the left or to the right, you realize that there's a real indeterminacy. And this is something that he really enjoyed doing, creating this very complex visual experience where the viewer is a full participant, and where the image is never fully resolved and very, very alive. Another great passion of Yoakum's is inserting biomorphic imagery into his compositions. And here's one of the most beautiful examples, a view of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, where you see this rock formation that has a kind of open mouth at left, and then little trees in the space where you would expect to see eyes. And so he's really interesting to turn landscape into bodies that then come to life. And as you go around the exhibition, you'll see that while this may be a kind of overt examples, there are also many examples that are borderline, where you wonder whether you are projecting or not. And when he was asked, Mr. Yoakum, as he was addressed by the Chicago artists who loved him, Mr. Yoakum, are there faces in your work? And he would be very cagey and say, well, if you see faces, perhaps there may be faces. So he never really revealed his intentions. Also, many of his drawings bear inscriptions, and here are two great examples. And he tended to be very precise about telling us where the locales were, where the subjects were, as if to, in a sense, tie down the excessive imaginative aspect of his creations to reality. And I think for him it's very crucial that there may be a gulf between what he shows you and what he tells you he shows you, but this is the point. This is very important, so that we see these places through his eyes in a completely new way. And he also, in addition to adding long inscriptions, he was very obsessive with signing his work, but also dating it. It's a kind of affirmation of selfhood through art that was likely a central concern for the artist. And coming from a family who had been oppressed and who had not been able to possess or have free movement and so on, being able to assert oneself through art was something very powerful. and really a way to claim an identity and an area of freedom. It was really for him an act of self-realization. And what's very important is that it was on his own terms, not on the terms of someone else or a convention, but really on his own terms. Also, one could wonder if by signing his work, it was not a way for him to claim ownership of the land he was presenting. This is my world, or this is the earth, and I belong to it. So through drawing, Yoakum was able to engage with his first-hand experiences and also explore new geographies imaginatively. Because as far as we know, it's not possible that he did not see all the places that he depicted, but he may have thought that through the spirit, through his imagination, he was able to see them, and that's what counted for him. He had strong beliefs in Christian Science, and for Christian scientists, the physical world is almost a lie. It's not to be trusted. What counts is really the spiritual world, and that's what counts. And so many of his drawings have a kind of spiritual intensity, and they seem to represent or claim another kind of reality. And here this drawing is one of the few biographical works that he's left us, and it's titled Back Where I Were Born, and this is presumably a place in Missouri. And you find a way to kind of travel back in time for him, reclaim some of his roots. And we have to bear in mind that someone like Yoakum with, in the first place, a complex background, and then who had itinerant life, to end in Chicago was not necessarily the easiest of experiences, and there's reason to believe that securing his own identity was an issue. And as far as we know, he seems to have downplayed his African American identity and to have played up his Native American identity as a way, one imagines, to set himself apart from the mostly African American neighborhood of Chicago, the South Side, where he lived. And so after a life really on the move, moving out and into the unknown, he seems to have turned inwards and used the medium of drawing to make that artistic but also spiritual journey. The fact that Yoakum started making art, namely drawings, in 1962 at the age of 71, after being inspired by a dream, which was following an illness, this suggests that he was, again, independent, determined, but also in possession of a strong creative vision. He had a very short but meteoric career, and you see him at his desk around 1969. And in 1967, a chance encounter led him to show some of his drawings in a church in Chicago. And here you see him proudly standing next to a few works, two of which have signs saying sold. So clearly he was proud. He created about 2,000 drawings in the space of 10 years, so he was prolific. And by the end of his life, some of his work had been presented at the Whitney and at MoMA in New York. And really, Yoakum was first and foremost an artist. He was first embraced by artists and professors associated with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and you see some of them here. And when they met him, they were amazed that this man, who they thought was a kind of a douanier Rousseau in their backyard, as they said. So it was like finding someone who was, come up with a new path forward for art that was just as exciting, if not more exciting, than anything they were taught at the school. And imagine, in the 1960s, they would have been exposed to pop art. They would have, probably been exposed to conceptual art, and here comes Mr. Yoakum with these extraordinary landscapes. And as the artist Ray Yoshida, whom you see at right in the picture at right, who was a professor at the school, he said, it was intriguing that, I quote, one man who had no idea of Michelangelo and Cézanne could invent form with an intensity equivalent to the art I knew. Yoakum reinforced the idea that we can learn as much from untrained outsiders as from the mainstream. And the artists who befriended Yoakum, Yoshida, Roger Brown, Cynthia Carlson, Gladys Nilsson, and Jean Nutt, and others, collected these drawings earlier on. And the fact that many works from their personal collections, the fact that many of their works are included in the present exhibition really is meant to point to this early reception of his work. And very quickly, a very funny poster designed by Jim Nutt, who with his wife Gladys Nilsson was an early promoter of Yoakum's work, and they've been great collectors, and they have lent beautiful works to this exhibition. In 1969, they organized a show in California in which Yoakum's work was displayed alongside theirs, and Nutt designed a poster for the show, which, while humorous, clearly attests to the admiration for Yoakum. So what you see, the towering, giant, respectable figure is Yoakum, and then the tiny figure at left and right are Gladys Nilsson and Jean Nutt, who are really tiny, and yet their cast shadows are actually taller than Yoakum, so they're a little irreverent as well. And just to end, I want to say that earlier on he was embraced by artists in Chicago. Then Yoakum was really embraced more widely by specialized audiences who really have a strong interest in folk art or untrained art and so on. And the advantage of an exhibition like this, we hope, is that it can really widen the appeal of someone like Yoakum and really make a claim that he belongs to, that he has made a unique contribution to the history of American art and the American landscape. And it's really a kind of essential chapter of that history. So thank you, and now I'd like to invite Pete to lead us through the singular orange world, Mr. McKissack.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Edouard and Tony, and for the invitation, and I'm so flattered to be here and really excited to talk about Jeff McKissack. I talk about Jeff a lot, and I could talk about Jeff all day. I really often do. I guess the first question to ask is anybody here never been to the Orange Show? Okay, see one, two, a couple. All right. Well, here's the Orange Show. Here's a picture of it. This is what it looks like today. This is over in the East End, 2401 Munger Street. And as you can see, it's a completely unique architectural structure. We call it a visionary art environment. And it was built single-handedly by Jefferson Davis McKissack between 1955 and 1979. And if we go into the interior here, we see we've got all kinds of things. We've got some awnings, we've got wagon wheels, we've got all this ornamental grill work, flags. Here's the central focus of the interior, this steamboat and a steamboat pond that Jeff made. Under the pavilion to the left is a steam buggy engine, which is supposed to power this steamboat and move it around the pond. You see a windmill up top, which is one of the many whirligigs that Jeff made and attached. That these things all spin in the wind. So if you ever go there, there's kind of a cacophony of clicking and whirling and spinning. It's really almost like a living organism. And anything Jeff could get his hands on, he would add to the display and turn into something pointing you to the benefits of the orange. Here we've got a creepy clown face that he bought from a party supply store that went out of business in the 1960s. Jeff liked to tell people how he got a really good deal on all this stuff. I think he paid $65 for 2 of these clown faces. He's also actually made a lot of the elements here inside the Orange Show. He made this map where oranges are grown in the United States. He'd find things like these animal heads and mannequins, and he would make some signs that immortalize poems that he wanted to connect to the display. And everything was, directed back towards the orange and its health benefits. All over the place you see these hand-cut scrap metal birds. He talked about how one day he was working on the orange show and he looked down at one of the discarded pieces that he'd cut out of something and it looked like a bird wing, and it inspired him to start making a lot of these birds that I think we have something like 50 of them perched all over the structure. All over the place, this beautiful mural tile work. Often he's talking about the orange, but sometimes it's just little aphorisms that in some way touched Jeff, and he wanted to broadcast these out. They're everywhere inside the Orange Show. It's a really kind of a didactic place, if you think about it. Here's Jeff. This is a picture taken about 1978 by a photographer named Don Francis, when he was still working on the Orange Show. Here's Jeff as a young man. I think he was 19 in this picture. He was born in 1902 in a place called Fort Gaines, Georgia, alongside the Chattahoochee River. And here's his dad's dry goods store in Fort Gaines. When Jeff was a young man, he had a room upstairs in this building where he had a record player, and he'd play records so his friends could come and dance. And he'd make homemade ice cream to serve. And this was Jeff's first gesture of hospitality to the community. This is what it looked like when the steamboats would pull up alongside Fort Gaines on the Chattahoochee River. This really made an impression on Jeff. Fort Gaines was a really small town. There wasn't much to do. And when the steamboat came in, he lived during the end of the steamboat era, but it was one of the 4 stops on the Chattahoochee, and visitors from other places would get off, they'd come into town, they'd spend money in his dad's dry goods store, and in turn, they would have these dances on the deck of the boat. They would light it up brightly, and it was really one of the only fun things to do in Fort Gaines, so it really made an impression on Jeff. And so many years later on, he has immortalized that experience in the steamboat pond here. If you think about it, it's kind of kind of an incredible engineering solution. How are you going to put the Chattahoochee River inside a structure that only takes up 2 city lots? Well, you make it round, and instead of going in a straight line, you make the boat go around in circles. You can see outlined on the edges here, let me see if I can get this to work. You can see the individual names spelled out in blue tile of the 4 stops alongside the Chattahoochee River. Eufaula, Alabama, so happens is where Rick Lowe is from. Back. Spoiler here. You can also start to see the amphitheater that he has surrounded this steamboat pond with. There's seating down below, and then up top here, hard to grip on this tablecloth. Anyway, you look up here and he's got another tier of stadium seating that he's made out of tractor seats that he collected over the years. This guy would find materials wherever he could. He was a postman in Houston, so he covered a lot of ground, and while they were tearing down the old city, he was collecting things like old pieces of fire escapes and garden statuary and piles of tiles that were discarded from teardowns, and he would just bring these things home and dump them in his yard. He knew it was going to use them someday. He didn't really know what for. He just saw a good deal when he saw one, and bought and bought and bought. Stepping back into his biography, a lot of these visionary artists and self-trained artists, there's kind of a general idea that they're somehow these naive, uneducated people, but that wasn't Jeff. He went to school. He went to Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. Now, this wasn't a very progressive place. While Jeff was there, one of the professors was fired for teaching the theory of evolution. I talked to one of the archivists at Mercer University, and he said dryly that during Jeff's time there, visionaries were probably few and far between. He went on to graduate study at Columbia University. He is said to have left after a couple of years when he had a fight with one of his professors, and he departed. He had a formative experience with Thomas Edison when he tried to go to the factory and get a job. Thomas Edison had a really strange test. It was kind of like a trivia test. And he thought that this test would distinguish the A men from the XYZ men. He wanted to work with the A men who could answer all of these questions. And really, these were just trivia questions. And the weird thing is, you would go and you would fill out this test, and you would actually have to stand there and watch Thomas Edison go through and grade your test, and he would be very upset with you if you didn't do well, and he considered Jeff to be an XYZ man, and he sent him on his way. So he went back down south during the Depression. He even worked on Wall Street a little bit. The stock market crashed, he lost his job. Went back to Georgia, where he began hauling produce through the South, including oranges. He would drive between Florida, where the oranges were grown, and the market in Atlanta, where they were sold. And that was his first encounter with the orange. He went into the service. He was in the Air Force only for a year. He was 40 years old when he enlisted, so he was a little bit perhaps past his prime. He sent a letter home that said that being in the Army was a young man's game. So he was honorably discharged, but he continued to contribute to the war effort by building ships in Jacksonville, Florida, and that's where he learned how to weld. Moved to Houston in the late 1940s. When Jeff was back in Fort Gaines around the time that his mom died, it is said that he really fell apart. His sisters had him committed to a mental institution for a couple of years. And, you know, the thing is, at that time, creative people, I think, weren't very understood. Jeff was always known around town as a quirky guy, but I don't think he was a crazy guy. I think he was just deeply misunderstood by his own family. And when he left the hospital, you can imagine the atmosphere was a little bit strained with his sisters at home, so he came to Houston to make a new life for himself. And if we look here, this is the Gulf Freeway shortly after its completion. And when it was first made, it only went as far as Telephone Road. And you can see over here, actually I'll take you over here, this is Munger Street in this old picture. And it drives me crazy, but the Orange Show lot is right about here. Just slightly out of frame. It would have been an empty lot, so we wouldn't see anything. But this is what the neighborhood looked like, and when Jeff moved to the neighborhood, it was still being developed, and there were a lot of empty lots. Jeff built this house for himself on Munger Street, and people who know the place know the look of the old house that used to be our office. It no longer is, but it's the house on the corner that's got the bird screens on the windows. This was the lot next door, and this house no longer exists. It was replaced in the 1980s. The construction was not good. Jeff made this place by hand. In some ways, he felt like it was an early version of the Orange Show. It is said that the inside of the house, you almost never let anybody inside, but it looked like a hoarder's house, and there was just stuff everywhere. His mannequins, all the stuff that later ended up in the Orange Show was just cluttering this house. And he bought 2 lots right across the street, 2 vacant lots, and this is the original permit for his structure. And you might notice here, it's a permit for a beauty parlor. He thought it'd be a good way to meet women. Only problem is, he didn't know how to run a beauty parlor, so he changed it into something else. He turned it into a plant store. This was something he was actually kind of adept at. He was working for the post office, but the plant store was kind of his side hustle. And Jeff wrote a book in 1960. It's called How You Can Live 100 Years and Still Be Spry. As he says here in the frontispiece, it's the result of 600 hours spent in research work in the public libraries of America and 40 years of study, observations, and accumulated experiences. Reading time, 1 hour. And in it, you know, he writes about what you should eat, how you should exercise, where you should take your vacations. He said you should do like him and go to Hot Springs, Arkansas every year, where he bathed in the radioactive waters. He said it would fix you right up. And a theme throughout this book is the importance of the orange. He really thought it was the perfect food and the perfect vehicle for nutrition. Here's a picture of the Orange Show, still under construction in the 70s. Looks pretty complete. You see a lot of stray cinder blocks out front, and these spire things are much taller now. Somehow he got them raised up a bit for better effect. But for all the pictures we have, the Orange Show looks pretty complete. We don't really have any pictures of what it looked like when it was a plant store or when there were pieces missing, which of course would be, I would be very interested to see like which came first and, how did this structure change over time? But really, once it was in place, it was pretty complete. And you see here, like if you think of the information that you saw in the book, he's got a whole display that you see when you come in, where pieces of this book are represented on these little signs, and he's trying to communicate his wonder about the fact that these nutrients can be in the ground, they can be processed by plants and trees, they grow fruit or nuts, we eat that, and the nutrients go into us, and our bodies turn it into energy. For Jeff, that was kind of a miracle. Here's Jeff, later on in life, at the Orange Show. You can see, like Yoakum, he signed his work, World's First Orange Show, a Jeff McKissack production. Now, this is not actually true. It was not the world's first Orange Show. If you Google the Orange Show, you'll see most of the top things that come up is about a convention center in San Bernardino, California. There's another Orange Show out there, and it predates our Orange Show. The old Orange Show was something that was created in the late 1800s by the California Orange Growers Association, and it was a trade show. The current Orange Show in San Bernardino, California is like the George R. Brown Convention Center, except with a lot less character. It's just kind of a bland convention center. But the original Orange Show was a kind of an expo where we can see in these old pictures, here's from 1926, the orange growers would come and they would set up these little displays made out of oranges. And you would have a pagoda, or you would have a windmill, or you would have a wishing well, all made out of oranges. And you can see there's kind of an echo of some of these things here. And I have a theory. You see, Jeff lived in Signal Hill, California for a few years in the 30s, and he worked for a bank there. He was living with, I think, his aunt and uncle. And I called the Historical Association out there, and I asked the guy, like, if somebody was living in Signal Hill in the 30s, would he have known about the Orange Show in San Bernardino? And this guy said, oh, yes, everybody in California knew about the Orange Show. There were streetcars that took you directly there. There was advertising all over the place. There's really no chance this guy would not have known about the Orange Show. So I think Jeff probably went, had a good time, enjoyed himself. Maybe he was already thinking about the orange and nutrition from his experiences during the Depression. And so many years later, when he was beginning to pivot and think of something else to do with his plant store that he, I guess, grew tired of, he eventually just gave away all the plants one day. This was either a name that had lodged in his head subconsciously and it came bubbling back up to the surface, or he might have just thought, these people in Houston, they are never going to know there's some other Orange Show out there. I'm going to claim this for myself. And he did claim it for himself. And, this is not a knock on Jeff at all. I mean, he made a structure that is completely unique. And we may not have the first Orange Show, but by far we've got the best Orange Show. You might recall this picture from Edouard's presentation. And the reason that I put it here is Jeff was as much the attraction as the Orange Show itself when he was alive. We see Yoakum standing here with these artists. And here's a picture of Jeff. He's with an artist here named Pat Danko and Pat's late husband, Jim. And I wrote to Pat, she lives in Spain now, and asked if I could use this photo and confirm that it was her. And I just want to read you something out of the email she sent me yesterday. She said, I have never known before or since any place with the magical innocence that permeated the Orange Show. Of course, this is because of the magical innocence of Jeff. It was his presence that filled the air at the Orange Show with innocence, with forgiveness, with caring. It was as if all your sins and faults were washed away just being there. I hope with all my heart that some of this magic remains. And I really think it does. I have talked to literally hundreds of people who have come through the Orange Show about their experiences. Some people who have come back again and again, many people who are arriving for the first time, and they absolutely do feel that sense of caring. We've got it right on the walls. Jeff wrote it in tile. We care about you. We are glad you are here. This is not just about nutrition. This is about community care. One of the visitors here, a very special person in my life, and probably many people here in this room, Marilyn Oshman. She got involved with Jeff and the Orange Show after it was discovered by Houston's artistic community. A lot of people, well, there's several people who claim to be the person who discovered the Orange Show. And it's hard to say who exactly it was. But among the first visitors was Jim Harithis, who had recently come to Houston to be the director of the CAM. And in Jim's retelling, he was just out driving around one day, taking a survey of the neighborhood because he wanted to get to know who the constituency out there was. He drove by, saw it, said, this is our Watts Towers. Y'all know the Watts Towers in LA? Okay, similar kind of visionary art environment. Bricolage, tiles, bottles, all that stuff, repurposed into a new structure. So the artists in Houston just started coming over there and hanging out with Jeff and sort of quizzing him about what he was doing. We're very close to University of Houston, so a lot of U of H students came over. As a matter of fact, a couple of them moved across the street, Ty and Ginny Eckel, and they're actually one of our best sources of information about Jeff and what he was doing because they lived right there. They saw it all the time. Ty was a sculptor, and he always tried to get Jeff to let him help with things. Jeff didn't want help. Jeff did everything by himself. If he really, really needed to, something was super heavy, he'd go drive around, find some day laborers, bring them back, tell them exactly what to do and how to do it. But for the most part, Jeff was working by himself, alone, all the time. And this was absolutely fascinating to members of the artistic community in Houston and really refreshing. And people would go over there all the time to hang out with Jeff, including Marilyn, became one of his really close friends. Jeff died in 1980, early 1980. He opened the Orange Show to the public in May 1979. He expected it was going to be a huge tourist attraction. He often said that he thought it was going to be bigger than the Astrodome. People were going to be lined up and down Munger Street every day waiting to come in and pay their $1 and go through the bike handlebar turnstile and enjoy the Orange Show. And when it opened in 1979, very few people came. It was really the same consistent crowd that had been coming to see him all along. And it's because Jeff never did anything to advertise. He just thought once he announced it was open that word of mouth would spread and people would show up, and they really didn't. Some people have romanticized the story and said, Jeff died of a broken heart when nobody came to see the Orange Show. But I think it's also part of when people are older people directed towards a real specific goal, they're going to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it until they achieve that goal. And once it's complete, sometimes that's the end. And he had a stroke when he was 78. He did not live to be 100 years old. He died at 78. And he left behind a note that said, if anything happens to me, call Marilyn. She'll know what to do. So people did. They contacted Marilyn Oshman, and she put together a group of donors. There were 20 of them, and they each put in $500, and the group bought the property and the structure itself for $10,000, donated it back to the Orange Show Foundation that they founded to protect and preserve and program the monument. And the early programming, a lot of it looked like this. Quirky stuff, animal shows, fashion shows, a lot of music, and the original group at the Orange Show was largely U of H students. These are the people who performed, these are the people who made up the audience, these are the people who did original restoration work on the monument too. The pond, as you can see, actually was at one point filled with water. We don't fill it with water anymore because turns into a preservation issue. It's leaky, but it was at one point full of water. Here's what it looks like in a performance scenario today. Here's a concert we did back in March to reopen the Orange Show after several years of closure due to COVID. We've brought back the programming. We do concerts here, performances. We had here recently an art installation where artists came in and placed works in the various alcoves and balconies and recesses around the Orange Show, inviting people to consider the space in a new way. We're looking here at an artwork by an artist named Gene Day, and he's, I guess, immortalizing members of the Davos group here on this little ziggurat. The steamboat is hidden behind some camouflage netting. Oh, that's how I know that the presentation is over. I probably went past my 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Pete. So it's really striking when you consider McKissack and Yoakum. They are very, very different artists. One is a draftsman, the other one makes installation. Yoakum really has this kind of vision and makes everything himself. McKissack has more incremental vision, right?
Yeah.
As he finds materials. And we could find more and more differences between them. I mean, I think McKissack is really community-oriented. Yoakum was much more withdrawn. And I think the list can go on, but what strikes me about the two of them is that they seem to find fairly early on a support system and to find in their own cities a good terrain for what they do. And I wanted to ask you, what's the secret about Houston that makes it a good place for this kind of interventions?
I would say two things. First of all is the weather. It's not get cloaked in snow for part of the year, so people can get active in their yards and make displays that survive all year long. But really the main thing is two words: no zoning. That's what it is. It's this wildcatter mentality that we have here in Houston. Property rights. I own this. You can't tell me if I want to cover my house with beer cans that I can't do it. I'm going to do it anyway. And also, no zoning. I mean, I used to live in a neighborhood that was a residential neighborhood with an air conditioning warehouse right in the middle of it. I mean, anything can pop up anywhere, even an Orange Show. And I will tell you, when Jeff was building this thing, the neighbors were not crazy about it. Clearly for some of these people, here is a guy who is up to no good. I don't know what he's doing over there, but hey, kids, don't walk down that way. Go the other way. Like, this was a thing. But over time, Jeff didn't care. Jeff was actually kind of outspoken about this. I should have put a picture in this presentation, but he's got a pillar that at one point in time had a little statue of Confucius on top. It's gone now, and during Jeff's lifetime, kids would break in at night, and they like to hide the statue of Confucius in different places around the Orange Show, so Jeff would have to go find it all the time and put it back. It says, I may be paraphrasing a little bit, but if you don't want to be criticized, do nothing, say nothing, be nothing. That was kind of Jeff's attitude. I'm just going to go for it, I'm going to do my thing, and I really don't care what the neighbors say.
So, thinking of Yoakum, when you ask yourself, what kind of art is it? I mean, the answer falls squarely on these art drawings. They're graphic works, some with color, some without. But in the case of the Orange Show, I mean, I'm still amazed by the range of categories you can use to qualify it. And I don't know if you could run us through, is it an amusement park? Is it a social sculpture? Is it an installation? What is it?
Oh, it's all of those things and more. This is a question that I ask people when they come in, and if they say that they've never been to the Orange Show before, the first thing I say is well, what do you think this is? Amusement park? Is this some kind of abandoned circus? We know it was a plant store, and there's certain places where you kind of look around and you see that little place that says the gift shop, that's obviously a little retail space. There are these different elevations here where it made sense. He probably had little collections of plants and things around. Clearly it's a piece of artwork. Jeff did not consider it to be art. Jeff didn't consider himself to be an artist. Jeff was an entrepreneur. He wanted your dollar. He wanted your dollar, and he wanted to communicate information. He didn't see what he did as being art. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a little story. One day, Willem de Kooning was in town. He had a show at U of H. And the artist, John Alexander, was asked to babysit de Kooning for the day and take him around, make sure he had a good time. So in the morning, they went to the Rothko Chapel, and then they went out for barbecue lunch, and then John thought he would bring de Kooning over to see the Orange Show. So they went over there, and Jeff and de Kooning got along like a house of fire. They were about the same age, talked and talked. De Kooning really got it as a young man. He was a sign painter. This is something he could really understand. He loved the color. He loved the aesthetics of it. They talked for a long time. And at one point, it was said, de Kooning here, he's a painter. And McKissack said, a painter? Well, you should consider moving to Houston. You can see all this new construction here. You'd have no difficulty at all getting a job. Jeff McKissack didn't know who de Kooning was. And for him, a painter was a guy on a ladder painting a house. De Kooning had just sold a painting for $2 million the previous year. It was like a record-setting sale. But that would not have made any difference to Jeff McKissack at all. He was that far outside of the art world.
And then equally, Yoakum was not really aware of the art of others. We know that he would sometimes go to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to meet some of his young friends and to buy materials, but they were amazed that he wouldn't look at the Cézannes and Gauguins and Impressionist and post-Impressionist work. So really interesting kind of myopia, if you will.
I would also mention that this extends to even people working within the same realm. Y'all are familiar with the Beer Can House? Okay, so the Beer Can House, the artwork on the Beer Can House began developing around 1968 and through the 70s and into the early 80s. So these guys overlapped, their lives overlapped, and they lived in different parts of the city, but they never encountered one another. And it so happens that John Milkovich, the guy who made the Beer Can House, his son Ronnie worked over at Schlumberger, which is a few blocks away from the Orange Show. So Ronnie knew about the Orange Show, and he was always trying to get his dad to go over there, and he wouldn't go. He went one time because John helped Ronnie make a little booth clad in beer cans for some kind of business fair they had over at Schlumberger. And because they were only a couple blocks away, they drove up to the Orange Show. Ronnie said, this is it. This is the thing I was talking about. Let's go in. And John said, nope, I seen it. Let's go home. These people are just so focused on their own thing that they don't, they're just not interested in anything else.
So now may be a good time to open it up to questions. So my colleague Tony is in the back with...
Raise your hand and I'll bring a mic to you.
So what's the direction or path for the Orange Show going forward? Is it to represent what's there now, or do you have some intention or thought about where it's going to go from here?
Oh yeah, we sure do. We got a lot going on at the Orange Show. We're coming, as I said, we're coming out of the COVID period, and we have a new director as of a year and a half ago, Tommy Ralph Pace. He's a great guy. He came over from ICA Miami. He's a real museum person, and we have we're bringing back the programming. That's the first main thing. We've returned concerts to the Orange Show. The art exhibit that you saw a glimpse of, but also we have a huge new property behind the Orange Show. And you can see it if we go back a ways. Okay, so you can see behind the Orange Show, there's this concrete slab structure that for years and years and years was a truck depot. It was built in the 50s, really around the same time that Jeff was started to build the Orange Show. And if you can imagine, I don't have a view of what the Orange Show looks like from the back, but anybody who's been over recently and has seen what the Orange Show looks like from inside the truck depot, you're just seeing bare cement blocks. Jeff didn't put any stucco on that side because it was never meant to be seen from that side. But you can imagine these workers, the truck depot eventually became a pallet factory, and there were working class dudes in there who saw this structure forming little by little over the years, and what were they thinking? So now we have a much larger campus, and that cement structure, it's bigger than a football field. It's 200 by 300 feet. We are using that also for music. We're using it for art installations. We hosted Zine Fest last year, and we'll host again. It's like a great space for that kind of expo. Plenty of room. These wide open truck bays create a cross breeze. at a time when people want to be outside, but at the same time under a cover to protect from weather and protect from the sun. It is really the ideal space, and as a ready-made, I am absolutely in love with it. It's not going to stay that way forever. It really kind of has this zombie apocalypse vibe over there with this pebbly lot. It's kind of like the beach with no water. And over the next 5 years, the campus is going to be completely transformed. We're working with architects to develop this plan right now. And we're going to be building a 3-story museum that's going to be climate-controlled galleries. We're going to have a permanent interpretive gallery about the history of the Orange Show, beer can house, some of the lost environments that don't exist anymore, the Flower Man's house, etc. We'll be showing works by contemporary artists, too, who are influenced by this kind of self-trained visionary art, including a lot of local Houston artists. I mean, I talked to so many artists, names that you would know, people from our community who grew up in Houston, and everybody has an Orange Show story. Oh, you know, I was a docent at the Orange Show when I was a kid. You know, the Orange Show is integral to the way that I look at the world and look at art. That's probably why I'm an artist. One artist told me everybody that he grew up with is either dead or in jail, and the reason that he's not is the Orange Show. So it's made a really significant impact on Houston artists, and so we want to feature them as well and make them feel at home and really close a loop. I mean, these were the people who were originally involved in the early 1980s. They're artists who have been part of our orbit ever since, involved with the art car parade. So as we develop our campus, it's a really great place to highlight their work too. And we have a lot of restoration work to do. The Orange Show, there's no foundation there. Jeff just started putting bricks and blocks down on bare ground and cementing things together and building up from there, which, you know, it's held together pretty well. But with alternating droughts and floods in Houston, like this structure is being pushed and pulled, and it's like there's tectonic plates. Huge cracks have formed that are really these days expansion joints. We can't even heal them because the stuff is still going to shift and move around. So we have some extensive engineering work that needs to happen to preserve the monument, but also we're working with a group right now just for surface level things to improve the visual experience. Organized a thing called the Orange Show Conservation Corps, where we're taking an assessment by conservators that was done about 10 years ago, updated last year. That's our playbook. This is being organized and supervised by staff, me and our property manager, Ruben Guevara, and run by paid contemporary artists in Houston. We've got 3 right now that are leading the program, and they're supervising and working with teams of volunteers who are people who come for seeking course credit, seeking community, lay people who are not artists who want to get involved. Any of you could get involved with the Orange Show Conservation Corps too. It's really fun. We hang out, we work on projects, we repaint, we scrub drips of paint off of those beautiful little tiles in a painstaking way. We're out there working when it's hot, but we're also out there working when it's cool. And I invite anybody to get in touch and join up with us on that endeavor.
Thank you. Is there one last question? Yes, please.
Yeah, we consider both of these visionary artists, and could you guys elaborate on what the aha moment is? My understanding is later in life, Yoakum began drawing, painting, creating, as did Jeff.
Should I start? Yeah. So, as far as we know, when he was in his early 70s, he had some form of illness, recovered from it, and as per his religious beliefs, he had to kind of do something to, be grateful towards God, and so he had a vision that he should draw, and that's what he started to do. And from what I understand of Christian Science, the idea is that the relationship to God is something very personal on which you have to work on a daily basis. And it seems that the way in which he worked, so assiduously in his drawings for the rest of his life was likely part of that spiritual mechanism. So it's really something that, he makes these drawings that have many more lines than are necessary in a way, all these tiny, so they're really labor intensive. They're labors of love, which he does, again and again.
I would say in Jeff's case, his aha moment is a little more vague. He did talk about this once in an interview, that he said he was trying to figure out what to do with this structure, and for years he was lost. And then one day he was outside looking at the structure, and just the words popped into his head: Orange Show, aha, Orange Show. That's what this place is going to be. But I want to connect Yoakum's story to a different visionary artist here in Houston. This is Cleveland Turner, the Flower Man. And anybody ever see the Flower Man's house when it still existed? Okay, great. He had 3 different houses over time, and in each of them he came up with this elaborate yard show basically made out of junk. The Flower Man rode around town on his bike. If he saw something interesting by the side of the road, he would pick it up, he'd put it in the basket, he'd bring it home, and he would incorporate it into his display. And his backstory is pretty interesting. He was on a bus making his way out to California. There was a stop here in Houston, so he got off, really just meant to spend the night, went on a bender, never got back on the bus, never left Houston. He loved the place. Oh God, there's a bar on every corner, is what he said. So eventually, he was a working class guy, but alcoholism got the better of his life, and he was discovered one day in 1983 lying by the side of the road, half dead, by a good Samaritan who picked him up, got him to the hospital. While he was in the hospital, he had a dream and a vision. In his mind, this was a whirlwind of junk flying up into the sky and then depositing itself along a long fence. And this is a very beautiful vision for him, and he said in his hospital bed, God, if I survive this, and if you keep the taste of wine out of my mouth, I'm going to replicate that display that I saw in that beautiful vision, and I'm going to do this for the community. And he really was. He brought color and life to the Third Ward, and had a smile for everyone. And of the people that I wrote about in this book, all the other makers had passed away, so I was getting secondhand sources, but Cleveland Turner was still alive at that time, and I spent hours and hours and hours with that guy on his front porch, and it is some of the best time I've ever spent in my life. And when we have our gallery in our permanent museum building, we're going to have some artifacts from the Flower Man there and tell his story too. I would love to find that bike if anybody knows. I had the name written down on a scrap of paper in 2013, shortly after Cleveland died, and the archivist no longer has that scrap of paper. So, and people over at row houses don't have that institutional memory either. So, if anybody ever talks to anyone and knows where that bike is, we would like to talk to them.
On that note, I'd like to thank Pete and thank everyone for coming tonight. And come again to the Menil and go to the Orange Show.
Please come. Is that good? Thanks.